Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave.
Post the colors! Order! Arms!
Chaplain Post will now deliver the invocation.
I invite you to pray with me in your tradition as I pray in mine. Creator of all, we thank you for the beauty of this day and for your presence with us as we remember all those who made the ultimate sacrifice. Give us the ability to make each day a day that will honor the memories of our EOD family. May the ceremony be blessed along with all of those who are in attendance today. Your strength enables us to protect others. Your providence keeps us safe. Help us turn our hearts towards you each and every day. In Jesus' name, amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, Captain Dean Mariano, Commanding Officer, Naval School, Explosive Ordnance Disposal.
Good morning. Welcome to the 52nd Annual Explosive Ordnance Disposal Memorial Ceremony. Today, we are here to honor and remember 343 EOD operators who made the ultimate sacrifice in the performance of their duties. This day is about paying our respect to the 341 men and women already enshrined on this wall, and to the 2 men that we will add this year. One of my favorite quotes is from Nelson Mandela, and he said, "I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. The brave man is not he who does not feel afraid, but he who conquers that fear." I can assure you 100% that the men and women on this wall who we're about to honor today understood exactly and completely the dangers inherent in their jobs. Yet they still volunteered. They conquered that fear, and they chose EOD anyway. Let there be no doubt, the men and women we are here to honor today personified bravery and courage. Bravery and courage of this magnitude demands respect, is worthy of celebration, and should always be remembered and honored. I'd like to start off today by welcoming those closest to the men and women on this wall, their families. I'd like to welcome all the Gold Star families who are able to be here in person. And specifically, I'd like to welcome the families of Sergeant Johnston and Lieutenant Crotty. I'd also specifically like to welcome the teammates that served alongside Sergeant Johnston, especially those from the 704th Ordnance Company, EOD. I apologize that we couldn't have everyone here this year. I think that's self-explanatory. But I'd like to welcome all those that are taking the time out of their days to remember this, to remember these men and women by joining us on the live stream. I truly hope that we can return to a fully open ceremony next year so that everyone who desires to attend can. I'd like to welcome the representatives from the services. Specifically, I'll welcome the senior representatives from each service. And representing the Marine Corps, Colonel Hassel from Marine Corps Training Command. Representing the Air Force, Brigadier General Kane, who's 96th Test Wing, commander of Eglin Air Force Base here. And sir, I'd specifically like to thank you for your guidance and leadership during this whole pandemic and entrusting enough in us to have this ceremony open to the Gold Star families and team members this year. And finally, thank you, Major General Hoyle, for representing the Army, but also serving as our guest speaker. It's a distinct honor and privilege to have someone who wears the crab, who truly understands what these men and women and their families went through. Major General Hoyle is a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point and an EOD officer. She has served in EOD as an EOD company commander, as a battalion executive officer, an EOD group commander, and the chief of ordnance. She has served in both Afghanistan and Iraq, and she is currently serving as the commanding general of the Military Surface Deployment Distribution Command. Thank you for being our guest speaker, Major General Hoyle.
Good morning, and a special good morning to our Gold Star families, every EOD soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine who's with us today, and of course the friends and family of all of these technicians and these families. Today we pause for our annual memorial ceremony to honor our brave EOD technicians who made the ultimate sacrifice protecting others. We also take the time to recognize the personal sacrifices their families have made in their contributions to our nation. A special thanks to everyone who's joining us both virtually and in person for this 52nd annual EOD Memorial Ceremony. It is a distinct privilege for me to stand before you as we remember the lives of those memorialized here. We're here today on National EOD Day, the first Saturday in May, to remember and to speak the names of our EOD brothers and sisters. These EOD brothers and sisters were also fathers, mothers, husbands, wives, sons, and daughters of our Gold Star families. I'm reminded of a quote by General George S. Patton, where he says, "It is foolish and wrong to mourn the men who died. Rather, we should thank God that such men lived." Our EOD family understands exactly what General Patton meant. The names of the technicians enshrined on our memorial are more than just names. Each represents the life of a soldier, a sailor, an airman, or a Marine. And we certainly thank God that they have lived. Each made a difference in our world, and each placed a mark in our hearts that can never be replaced. And all certainly had what is arguably one of the toughest jobs our services have had to offer. We remember. Today we will enshrine the names of two of our fallen EOD brethren, U.S. Navy Petty Officer 2nd Class James Devaney and U.S. Army Sergeant James Johnson. And we pause again to honor the U.S. Coast Guardsman Lieutenant Jim Crotty. Their names will forever be repeated and never forgotten. They will not be forgotten because of the members of our own EOD community who continue to research their biographies and the circumstances surrounding our fallen EOD brethren who went before us. And most notably, some members of our community, led by the passions of Lieutenant Colonel retired Bob Leindecker and Command Sergeant Major retired Mike Vining, who help and lead other individuals to recognize and research those who have fallen. Their efforts and the efforts of many others ensure that we recognize each for their contributions to our field and to our nation. The contributions of our brethren are not only reflected here on the memorial, but within the badge that all EOD technicians wear. The wreath on the badge is what I want to focus on. The wreath is symbolic of the achievements and the laurels gained by minimizing accident potentials through the ingenuity and the devotion to duty of our members. The wreath on our badge represents the memory of those EOD personnel who gave their lives while performing EOD duties. Each and every technician who wears the badge has been affected by those who are memorialized here. The history of our EOD fallen is carried with us everywhere. We remember. Let me take you back to 1941. A young Lieutenant Jimmy Crotty became a member of the United States Coast Guard and entered Navy Mine Recovery Class number 1. He was a Buffalo, New York native, and upon graduation, the Coast Guard assigned him to the minesweeper USS Quail. The vessel's mission was to clear a lane through the moored minefield protecting Manila Bay, allowing U.S. submarines and amphibious aircraft to transit in and out of the bay at night. He and his shipmates were taken prisoner by the Japanese, and Lieutenant Crotty is the only member of the U.S. Coast Guard who was held prisoner of war in the 20th century and since the War of 1812. He was also the only active duty Coast Guardsman who participated in the defense of the Philippines. He died in Cabanatuan prison in the Philippines during a diphtheria epidemic. And now we know that Lieutenant Crotty's name is already on the memorial, but today's memorial ceremony is the first time that his family could attend since his remains were repatriated back to the United States in 2019. Today we have his great-nephew Jim and Jim's wife Kay here to honor their great-uncle today. There's something very special about a nation that will never leave a fallen comrade. The continued dedication of this nation to that purpose is what returned Lieutenant Crotty to his family 77 years later. Another New York native, New York City to be more specific, was Petty Officer 2nd Class James Devaney. He graduated the Navy Bomb Disposal Class number 22. And upon graduation, he was assigned to Hunters Point Navy Yard in San Francisco to conduct additional training in preparation for his deployment to the Pacific Theater. During a training event, while teaching the construction of an improvised munition, the munition he was working with failed to function as designed. He passed during this training event at the young age of 26, back in 1944. Petty Officer Devaney made the ultimate sacrifice before the wall was built, and today he will be added to that memorial. We remember. Sergeant James Johnson, born in Texas, but raised in the town of Trumansburg, New York, enlisted in the Army in 2013. Ultimately, he was assigned to the 704th Ordnance Company in Fort Hood, Texas, and deployed to southern Afghanistan in support of Operation Freedom Sentinel. He is fondly remembered for donning Hawaiian shirts and his engaging personality, but his drive to serve others caused him to trade those bold shirts for the uniform. This came as no surprise to anyone, as James had already served as a volunteer firefighter as he grew up as a child. Unfortunately, his service came to an end during a close-quarters firefight in southern Afghanistan. Krista, you and your daughter Jamie will forever be a part of the EOD family. James's courage and sacrifices will never be forgotten. And to the rest of the family here with us today, I hope you find solace knowing that James laid down his life protecting others. We remember. This memorial is more than just names on a wall, and at the end of today's ceremony, it will serve as a tribute to the 343 EOD technicians who made the ultimate sacrifice in service to their country, dating back to the formation of the explosive ordnance disposal community during World War II. It recognizes and preserves the legacy of the sacrifices and service of our fallen warriors and their families. We remember.
Service detail, post!
We will now place a wreath in front of each cenotaph while the names of the fallen are read. Representing the United States Army are Lieutenant Colonel Lewis and Command Sergeant Major Allender.
Army EOD technicians killed during military operations are Private Clinton E. Malenix, Private First Class Lawrence C. Paystrup, Sergeant Ira D. Wiggins, First Lieutenant William W. Ferris Jr., First Lieutenant John A. Randall, Staff Sergeant Edwin T. Walker, Second Lieutenant Robert B. Roger, Technical Sergeant Harry F. Rapp, First Lieutenant Delafield H. Wyckoff, First Lieutenant Frank E. Smith Jr., Sergeant Carl E. Christensen, Private First Class John J. Gotti, Captain Frederick H. Dillon, First Lieutenant Stephen Todorovich, First Lieutenant Mac T. Jarrett, Sergeant Alfred F. Sanders, Sergeant John Blasco, Sergeant Carmine C. Nicastro, Sergeant Dominic L. Albanese, First Lieutenant William J. Brodish, Technical Sergeant William C. Tate, Technical Sergeant Louis Brevetto, First Lieutenant Bertram Ostro, Corporal Norman Reynolds, Private Joseph T. Saradensky, Technical Sergeant James H. Eberly, Corporal Alwyn H. Scarda, Technician 5th Grade Russell F. Byington, First Lieutenant Sherwood L. Racy, Second Lieutenant Charles F. Hale, Technician 5th Grade Elmer L. Allison, Technician 5th Grade Joseph J. Kozik, Technician 5th Grade Corporal Robert F. Chapman, Technician 5th Grade Corporal Donald E. Bailey, Technical Sergeant Stephen H. Matvey, Captain George Collins, Technician 5th Grade Corporal Frank L. Dickinson, Captain Robert S. Abbott Jr., Technical Sergeant Jack B. Duddy, Technician 5th Grade Corporal Joseph F. Fidel, Technician 5th Grade Corporal Donald W. Vickers. Captain George C. Sarah. Second Lieutenant Arthur J. Zelmer. Technical Sergeant Francis H. Zern. Technician 5th grade Corporal Elmer J. Craddock. Technician 5th grade Corporal Raymond J. Rondeau. Sergeant Roland H. Ingval. Sergeant Homer M. Baer. First Lieutenant Earl M. Hamilton. Captain Raymond L. Badershell. Technician 5th grade Corporal George H. Beggs. Technician 5th grade Corporal Harry Pollock. Captain Richard A. Metris. Technical Sergeant Howard A. Lythe. Technician 5th grade Corporal William J. Hackett. Technician 5th grade Corporal Anthony Pergrassi. First Lieutenant William F. Alter. Captain Samuel R. Broff, Jr. Technician 5th grade Corporal John Becky. Technician 5th grade Corporal Walter E. Lathon. Technician 5th grade Corporal Clinton E. Gear. Technical Sergeant Leonard P. Altick. First Lieutenant Leonard K. Tunderman. Second Lieutenant Benjamin G. Hussey. Private Jack V. Austin. Corporal Lawrence G. Yost. Master Sergeant John F. Faulkner. Private Charles A. Jones. Private First Class Harold L. Sloppy. Master Sergeant Norman R. Durfee. Master Sergeant Frank R. Hawley. Master Sergeant Albert J. Barron. Captain Carl W. Johnson. Sergeant First Class Ralph W. Poole. Corporal Robert J. Roberge. Private Michael A. Castagliola. Sergeant First Class Richard R. Knox. Specialist 5 Betul A. Perez. First Lieutenant Richard R. Dygert. Specialist 5 Paul W. Rice. Specialist 4 Jerry W. Corcoran. Specialist 6 Fred M. Cuds Jr. Master Sergeant Charles L. Robbins. Specialist 6 Leon G. Nelson. Specialist 6 Paul B. McKinley. Specialist 5 Melbourne D. Moore. Captain George A. Fisher. Sergeant Major Donald E. Calhoun. Sergeant First Class Charles O. Baker III. Master Sergeant Biddle C. Izard Jr. Specialist 6 Lewis D. Black. Master Sergeant Donald E. Brosius. Captain Briggs K. Cecilia. Staff Sergeant Jerry E. Keckle. Captain Paul B. Bowman. Staff Sergeant Robert A. Whitted Sr. Staff Sergeant Rodney G. Jondro. Staff Sergeant Lewis Payne Sr. Captain Frederick P. Smith. Master Sergeant James E. Austin. Master Sergeant Jackie W. Barnwell. Captain Gary J. Guest. Captain James W. Peterson. Master Sergeant Edward W. Metcalf. Specialist 5 Harry D. McWhinney Jr. Staff Sergeant Roy Phillips. Specialist 4 Daniel E. Helton. Sergeant Major Kenneth R. Foster. Staff Sergeant Christopher J. O'Reilly Jr. Staff Sergeant Nancy A. Ozakuski. Specialist 5 Ronald L. Kostenbader. Specialist 4 Joseph J. Tripodi. First Lieutenant Michael M. Cochran. Sergeant First Class John R. Vasco. Staff Sergeant Lawrence D. Herman. Staff Sergeant Kenneth F. Schaefer. Major Thomas M. Zeugner. Sergeant First Class Donald T. Murphy. Staff Sergeant Ricky L. Bunch. Specialist Ross A. Deerking. Staff Sergeant Richard N. Boudreau II. Sergeant Philip M. Friley. Specialist Jason D. Wildfong. Staff Sergeant Adam T. Harding. Staff Sergeant Brian T. Craig. Staff Sergeant Justin J. Galuski. Sergeant Jamie O. Moggins. Staff Sergeant Joseph E. Robesky Jr. Staff Sergeant Kimberly A. Fenstock Volts. Staff Sergeant Michael J. Sutter. Staff Sergeant Richard P. Ramey. Sergeant Elijah T. Wong. Corporal Corey M. Hewitt. Staff Sergeant Christopher L. Shepard. Staff Sergeant Eric M. Stephanie. Staff Sergeant Daniel G. Gresham. Staff Sergeant Russell J. Verdugo. Staff Sergeant Johnny V. Mason. Sergeant First Class Kevin P. Jessen. Sergeant First Class Scott R. Smith. Staff Sergeant Joshua P. Matero. Command Sergeant Major Jonathan M. Lankford Sr. Sergeant James K. Healy. Sergeant First Class Lawrence D. Izell. Staff Sergeant Brian E. Studer. Staff Sergeant Edmund L. Lowe. Staff Sergeant Thomas D. Rabjohn. Specialist Wade A. Slack. Staff Sergeant Shane S. Bernard. Staff Sergeant Derek J. Farley. Staff Sergeant Matthew J. West. Captain Jason T. McMahon. Staff Sergeant Chauncey R. Mays. Specialist Christopher G. Stark. Staff Sergeant Mark C. Wells. Staff Sergeant Eric S. Trueblood. Staff Sergeant Michael J. Garcia. Staff Sergeant Israel P. Nuanez. Staff Sergeant Eric S. Holman. Staff Sergeant Jonathan P. Schmidt. Staff Sergeant Kenneth W. Bennett. Staff Sergeant Nicholas J. Reed. Sergeant First Class Jeffrey C. Baker. Staff Sergeant Joshua J. Bowden. Specialist Justin R. Helton. Sergeant James A. Slape. Sergeant Joseph P. Coletti. This year, we will be honoring and placing the name of the following Army EOD technician on the memorial. Sergeant James G. Johnston. We remember
Major General Hoyle will present a flag that has been flown over the memorial to the family member of the fallen soldier. Representing the United States Marine Corps are Lieutenant Colonel Cucinato and Master Sergeant Matthews.
Marine EOD technicians killed during military operations are Second Lieutenant Leslie C. Blacksley, First Lieutenant Verrill L. Rieger, Tech Sergeant John J. Moling, Corporal Clelly C. Whitted, Jr., Tech Sergeant Paul E. Meister, Staff Sergeant John M. Spudich, Corporal Marshall E. Bennett, Staff Sergeant Robert E. Morris, First Lieutenant Allen M. Harris, Captain Ben C. Porter, Sergeant John O. Bird, Sergeant Howard R. Stahala, First Lieutenant Gilbert L. Brown, Master Sergeant George E. Buck, Jr., Sergeant Jesus R. Vasquez, Staff Sergeant Gene M. Morrison, Captain James W. Jones, Chief Warrant Officer for William L. Vick, Staff Sergeant John R. Beck, Captain Marvin Cook, Jr., Staff Sergeant Clarence E. Fetty, Staff Sergeant James S. Partial, Staff Sergeant Richard L. Shuryok, Sergeant James H. Underwood, Staff Sergeant Allen H. Soifert, Sergeant Michael C. Matoni, Captain William C. Burmeister, Staff Sergeant Roy W. Burt, Staff Sergeant Robert T. Calloway, Staff Sergeant William C. Dane, Gunnery Sergeant Michael J. Clark, Staff Sergeant Jason A. Leto, Staff Sergeant Joel P. Dameron, Gunnery Sergeant Darrell W. Boatman, Staff Sergeant Daniel A. Sue, Master Sergeant Brett E. Angus, Staff Sergeant Kenneth B. Pospisil, Gunnery Sergeant Justin R. Martoni, Gunnery Sergeant John D. Fry, Sergeant Justin L. Noyes, Sergeant John P. Phillips, Staff Sergeant Dwayne E. Williams, Sergeant Justin T. Walsh, Staff Sergeant Dustin M. Gould, Staff Sergeant William J. Callahan, Staff Sergeant Peter Woodall, Staff Sergeant Stephen J. Wilson, Sergeant Sean P. Martin, Sergeant Michael E. Toyotow, Staff Sergeant Christopher D. Strickland, Staff Sergeant Daniel L. Hanson, Gunnery Sergeant John H. Roy III, Staff Sergeant Mark A. Wojciechowski, Chief Warrant Officer 2 Wilkie, Chief Warrant Officer 2 Ricky L. Richardson, Jr., Gunnery Sergeant David S. Spicer, Master Sergeant Adam F. Benjamin, Staff Sergeant Aaron J. Taylor, Gunnery Sergeant Christopher W. Eckerd, Staff Sergeant Adam L. Perkins, Gunnery Sergeant Christopher L. Eastman, Master Sergeant Daniel L. Fetter, Gunnery Sergeant Floyd E. Hawley, Staff Sergeant Joshua J. Collins, Staff Sergeant Jordan B. Emmerich, Sergeant Jason T. Smith, Gunnery Sergeant Justin E. Schmalsteg, Staff Sergeant David P. Day, Gunnery Sergeant Ralph E. J. Pate, Jr., Sergeant Daniel J. Patron, Staff Sergeant Nicholas A. Sprotzoff, Staff Sergeant Stephen J. Dunning, Staff Sergeant Joseph DeAugustine, Staff Sergeant Joseph H. Fankhauser, Sergeant John P. Holing, Staff Sergeant Sky Moat, Gunnery Sergeant Gregory J. Mullins, Staff Sergeant Matthew R. Marsh, Staff Sergeant Eric W. Summers, Sergeant Miguel Ortiz, Staff Sergeant David B. Lyon. We remember.
Representing the United States Navy are Lieutenant Commander Rogers and Command Master Chief Stafford.
Navy EOD technicians killed during military operations are Ensign John M. Howard, Lieutenant Thomas J.E. Crotty, Chief Petty Officer John H. Baldridge, Ensign Harris R. Hester, Ensign George E. Arthur, Petty Officer Thomas B. Keene, Lieutenant Junior Grade Alvin E. Vetter, Petty Officer Robert P. Burr, Lieutenant Junior Grade Charles F. Letson, Lieutenant Junior Grade John H. Fessler, Chief Petty Officer William C. Meadville, Lieutenant Junior Grade Delbert W. Lewis, Lieutenant Junior Grade John T. S. Ock, Lieutenant Junior Grade George P. McNair III, Lieutenant Lawrence L. L. Heidman, Lieutenant Junior Grade Marvin W. Johnson, Lieutenant Junior Grade Gardner T. Hutchins, Ensign Charles W. Grice Sr., Ensign John S. Parker Jr., Petty Officer Monroe A. Hudson, Ensign Robert M. Yeager, Warrant Officer Maurice T. Cleary, Ensign James H. Phillips, Ensign Billy M. McCrae, Chief Petty Officer Manuel Gallegos, Ensign Calvin E. Keach, Lieutenant Stephen C. Plotz, Lieutenant Commander Robert E. Condon, Petty Officer Jerry L. Winningham, Lieutenant Junior Grade Bruce S. McFadden, Petty Officer Richard R. Milady, Warrant Officer Donald V. Roberts, Warrant Officer Charles D. Alderman, Petty Officer Ralph E. Liu, Jr., Lieutenant Donald P. Juneman, Senior Chief Petty Officer Robert R. Schamberger, Petty Officer Stephen L. Morris, Petty Officer Frank E. Morrison, Chief Petty Officer Paul A. Rico, Lieutenant Commander Don A. Home, Chief Petty Officer Joseph T. Hendricks, Chief Petty Officer Nicholas Wilson, Petty Officer Edward A. Koth, Chief Petty Officer Paul J. Darga, Petty Officer David S. Roddy, Chief Petty Officer Gregory J. Billiter, Petty Officer Joseph A. McSween, Petty Officer Curtis R. Hall, Chief Petty Officer Patrick L. Wade, Petty Officer Jeffrey L. Cheney, Petty Officer Kevin R. Bewley, Petty Officer Louis A. Safant, Petty Officer Tyler J. Trahan, Petty Officer Tony Randolph, Senior Chief Petty Officer Craig M. Vickers, Chief Petty Officer Nicholas H. Knoll, Petty Officer Chad R. Regilin, Petty Officer Taylor J. Gallant, Lieutenant Christopher E. Moscow, Petty Officer Sean P. Carson, Chief Petty Officer Jason C. Finan, Senior Chief Petty Officer Scotty C. Dayton. This year, we'll be honoring and placing the name of the following Navy EOD technician on the memorial. Petty Officer Second Class James P. Deviney.
This year, we will also be honoring the name of the fallen Coast Guardsman EOD technician whose remains were to return home last year, Lieutenant Thomas J.E. Crotty. We remember.
Captain Dean Mariano will present a flag that has been flown over the memorial to the family member of the fallen Coast Guardsman. Representing the United States Air Force are Lieutenant Colonel Turcotte and Chief Master Sergeant Phillips.
Air Force, EOD technicians killed during military operations are Airman 2nd Class Nelson L. Sanderson, Captain Ernest McFerrin, Technical Sergeant Claude H. Bunch, Technical Sergeant Aaron G. Fidium, Jr., Staff Sergeant David L. Hubbard, Jr., Staff Sergeant Ralph T. Berry, Technical Sergeant Richard D. Milton, Technical Sergeant James D. Farmer, Senior Master Sergeant Gerald J. Stryzak, Senior Airman Raymond J. Bianchi II, Airman First Class Blaine J. Meyer, Airman First Class Dustin W. Olson, Staff Sergeant, Technical Sergeant Walter M. Moss, Master Sergeant Brad A. Clemens, Captain Kermit O. Evans, Technical Sergeant Timothy R. Weiner, Senior Airman Elizabeth A. Lonke, Senior Airman Daniel B. Miller, Senior Airman William N. Newman, Technical Sergeant Anthony L. Capra, Technical Sergeant Philip A. Myers, Staff Sergeant Brian D. Berkey, Technical Sergeant Anthony C. Campbell, Jr., Technical Sergeant Adam K. Gannett, Senior Airman Michael J. Burris, Senior Airman Daniel J. Johnson, Staff Sergeant Joseph J. Hamsky, Technical Sergeant Christopher M. Soulsby, Technical Sergeant Daniel L. Duville, Technical Sergeant Matthew S. Schwartz. Senior Airman Brian R. Bell. Airman First Class Matthew R. Seidler. We remember.
Ladies and gentlemen, please rise and remain standing for the benediction, three-volley salute, and taps.
Will you pray with me? Lord of power and might, whose mercy is everlasting, guard and guide those who place their lives in the balance to ensure the safety of those nearby. Look with favor upon those with the prowess and skill to disarm explosive devices, render them safe, and remove them from others of the threat of harm. Bless those who have been set apart by this hazardous duty, and give support to their families and loved ones who wait through each tense call. Receive into eternal rest those who have been given their lives, and bring healing to those who mourn. Grant that in the EOD family there may be unity of spirit for the well-being of all. To your glory, with grateful hearts, we thank you, loving God. Amen.
Retire the colors!
concludes the memorial ceremony. Please give a moment to this year's families to view the memorial before coming forward for viewing. God bless you all, and God bless America.
You